Before Julian, my life was a Jackson Pollock painting. It was a frantic, vibrant, and utterly chaotic masterpiece of my own making. My tiny apartment was a testament to a mind that moved too fast to be bothered with trivial things like organization. Stacks of books leaned at precarious angles, coffee mugs spread in dusty corners, and my writing desk was a layered archaeological dig of notebooks, ink pens, and crumpled-up drafts. I was a freelance writer, which was a polite way of saying I lived in a constant, low-grade panic, lurching from one deadline to the next, fueled by caffeine and the sheer terror of not making rent. My diet consisted of takeout, my sleep schedule was a myth, and my heart was a revolving door of passionate but ultimately doomed relationships. I loved the mess. I thrived in it. Until one day, I didn't. The breaking point was not a dramatic event, but a slow, creeping exhaustion. The chaos I had once mistaken for freedom began to feel like a cage of my own making. The frantic energy felt less like passion and more like desperation. I was 28 years old, and I was tired. Tired of the instability. Tired of the loneliness that settled in after the whirlwind of a failed romance. Tired of feeling like I was constantly running 5 steps behind my own life. I craved silence. I craved order. I craved a steady hand to calm the tremor in my own. And then I met Julian. I was at a fundraiser, an event I had been given a ticket to by a client, feeling deeply out of place in my one good dress when he approached me. He was a systems analyst for a major tech firm, and he radiated a calm, controlled energy that felt like a force field. He was handsome in a clean, classical way, with sharp blue eyes that seemed to see everything, not in a judgmental way, but as a series of data points to be understood and organized. He didn't seem to mind my slightly frazzled energy, or my tendency to talk too fast when I was nervous. In fact, he seemed fascinated by it. He listened to me with an unnerving focus, as if he were debugging my chaotic sentences to find the core logic underneath. "You have a beautiful mind, Lena," he told me on our first date. "It's just running 1,000 programs at once. You could use a better operating system." It should have been an insult, but the way he said it, with such genuine analytical admiration, made it sound like the most profound compliment I had ever received. He saw my chaos not as a flaw, but as a problem to be solved, and I, so weary of my own internal pandemonium, was more than ready to hand him the administrative password to my life. He moved into my life like a master architect entering a condemned building. At first, his changes were a profound relief. The first thing he did was tackle my kitchen. I watched, mesmerized, as he emptied my cluttered cabinets and reorganized everything with a ruthless efficiency. Spices were alphabetized. Canned goods were arranged by type and expiration date. He bought a set of identical glass containers for all my dry goods, each one perfectly labeled. "See," he said, his voice a soft, reassuring hum. "This way, there's no guesswork, no stress, just harmony." And he was right. Looking at my new, pristine kitchen, I felt a wave of calm so profound it was almost dizzying. It was the first quiet corner in my mind I'd had in years. From the kitchen, his benevolent optimization spread to the rest of the apartment. He installed minimalist shelves and helped me sort my book collection, not by the chaotic system of affection I used, but by the Library of Congress classification. My vibrant, mismatched collection of coffee mugs was carefully boxed up and replaced with a set of 6 identical, handleless white ceramic cups that nested together perfectly. "They're beautiful," I said, trying to sound convinced. "They are correct," he replied with a gentle smile. "There's a beauty in correctness, Lena. In order." I fell in love with that order. I fell in love with him. His stability was an anchor in the storm of my life. He was patient and kind, and he seemed to genuinely delight in creating a perfect, frictionless world for me. When he asked me to move in with him into his large, minimalist apartment that resembled a modern art gallery, I didn't hesitate. I was ready to leave the Jackson Pollock painting of my old life behind. I was ready for the clean white canvas he offered. I didn't realize that he intended to be the only artist and that the only color he would allow was gray. Julian's apartment was a testament to his philosophy. Structure is freedom. The walls were a stark gallery white. The floors were polished concrete. The furniture was sparse and architectural, each piece chosen for its form and function, with no room for sentimentality. There was no clutter. There were no extraneous objects. To him, this wasn't emptiness. It was clarity. A clear space promotes a clear mind, he'd say, and for a while, my mind did feel clearer. The constant, low-grade hum of my own disorganization was gone, replaced by a serene, quiet hum of his perfect system. The rules were introduced gradually, gently, like a rising tide, each one a logical solution to a problem I didn't even know I had. The rules were his love language. They started with household chores. The dishwasher rule was first. He drew me a diagram, a laminated chart he posted on the inside of a cabinet, showing the optimal placement for every type of dish. It's about maximizing water flow and space, he explained earnestly. Doing it the wrong way is just wasteful, so I followed the diagram. It was easier than arguing. Then came the laundry rules. Lights, darks, delicates, that was standard. But Julian had subcategories. He had specific, organic, scent-free detergents for each type of fabric. He had a tri-fold method for towels that ensured they stacked with geometric precision. He showed me the method 3 times, correcting my hand position until I could replicate it perfectly. There, he said, admiring my first perfect stack. Now that is a properly folded towel. Don't you feel better knowing it's done the right way? And the strange thing was, a small part of me did. It was the part of me that was exhausted, the part that craved a simple, achievable perfection in a world where I often felt like a failure. The rules soon crept beyond household chores and into the fabric of our daily lives. He created a shared digital calendar that became the gospel of our existence. It was color-coded and synced to all our devices. Yellow for work blocks, blue for nutrient-balanced meals, green for optimized fitness, pink for quality relationship time. Our meals were planned a month in advance, a repeating cycle of lean proteins and complex carbohydrates. Our workouts were scheduled, alternating between cardio and strength training for maximum physiological benefit. Even our intimacy was often scheduled. Wednesday and Saturday nights, from 10:15 to 11 o'clock p.m., were highlighted in pink. He said it was to ensure we always made time for each other, to keep the spark alive. To me, it felt like the spark was being scheduled into submission. My work, my chaotic and unpredictable writing, was the biggest challenge for his system. He designed a home office for me within our apartment that was a marvel of minimalist efficiency. But it was also a creative sensory deprivation chamber. He insisted my desk remain clear at all times, except for my laptop and one approved notebook. He set up a schedule for me, mirroring the one he'd made in my old apartment, but now it was a mandate, not a suggestion. You can't just wait for inspiration to strike, Lena, he'd say gently, when he found me staring blankly at the wall instead of typing. That's a romantic myth. Creativity is a muscle. It needs a workout regimen. He'd set a timer for my creative writing block. The soft, insistent ticking felt like a countdown to my own failure. My writing, once a wild garden, became a sad, sterile hydroponic lab. I produced words, but they were lifeless. They were orderly and structured and dead on the page. Perhaps the most insidious rule was the one that governed my own appearance. He read a book about seasonal color analysis and declared I was a soft summer. He went through my closet and lovingly purged it of anything that wasn't in my prescribed palette of muted blues, grays, and pinks. My favorite orange sweater, the one that always made me feel cheerful. This color screams, Lena, he said sadly. It's aggressive. It's not in harmony with your essence. He donated it to charity. I felt a pang of loss, but I told myself he was right. He had an eye for these things. He was helping me be the best version of myself. My friends, the few chaotic, vibrant ones from my old life, didn't fit into the new system. My best friend, Simone, an artist who was always covered in a fine mist of paint and charcoal, was Julian's worst nightmare. He never forbade me from seeing her. He simply made it impossible. Simone is coming over tonight, I'd say. Oh, he'd reply, a flicker of pain in his eyes. I see. I was hoping for a quiet evening. Her energy is just very high impact. It tends to disrupt the harmony of our space. The guilt would be immediate. I was a bad partner for inviting chaos into his sanctuary. I started making excuses to Simone, canceling plans, until eventually, my oldest friendship faded into a series of unanswered texts. I had traded my vibrant, messy world for his quiet, perfect one, and I had done so willingly. I had handed him the keys to my life, and he had systematically replaced every part of me with a better, more efficient model. He was the architect of my life, and I was the grateful resident of the beautiful, minimalist cage he had built. I had forgotten what the sky looked like from the outside. For a long time, the sheer calm of our life was enough. The absence of financial panic, the predictability of our days, the quiet hum of a perfectly optimized existence, it was a powerful anesthetic. I mistook order for peace. I mistook control for love. Julian was a benevolent dictator, and I was his willing subject. The rules were not just rules. They were the pillars of our relationship, the testament to his care for me. To break a rule was not just an act of defiance. It was an act of ingratitude. It was a rejection of him, of the perfect life he had so painstakingly designed. And so, I became the perfect partner. I memorized the dishwasher diagram. I mastered the tri-fold towel technique. I wore my soft summer palette with a serene smile. I ate my pre-portioned meals of grilled chicken and steamed broccoli. I dutifully worked during my creative writing blocks, producing technically proficient but soulless prose. I was a ghost in my own life, haunting the pristine white rooms of the existence he had built for me. And I told myself every single day that I was happy. This is happiness, I would think, as I placed my perfectly clean white mug onto its designated coaster. This is peace. The first crack in the foundation of my perfect cage came not from within, but from the outside world, from the messy, unpredictable life I had tried so hard to leave behind. It came in the form of my younger sister, Chloe. Chloe was my opposite, my chaotic other half. Where I had become quiet and compliant, she was loud and rebellious. Her life was a series of passionate, impulsive, and often disastrous decisions. Julian disapproved of her entirely. He had classified her as a stress-inducing variable and had created a rule that our interactions with her be structured and time-limited. One Tuesday night, she called me, her voice a frantic, sobbing mess. "Lena, I need you," she cried. "Michael broke up with me. He just walked out. I'm a wreck. Can you please just come over?" My heart lurched. It was an immediate, sisterly instinct. Of course I would go. "I'm on my way," I said. As I grabbed my purse, Julian emerged from his office, his face a calm, placid mask. "What's going on?" "It's Chloe," I explained, my hands trembling as I tried to pull on my shoes. "Michael left her. She's really upset. I have to go over there." He didn't move. He just stood there, blocking my path to the door. He glanced at the digital calendar on the wall. 8:30 p.m. to 9:30 p.m. Shared reading hour. "My love," he said, his voice the epitome of gentle reason. "It is 8:35. We have our scheduled financial review." Chloe's romantic dramas are a recurring and frankly predictable pattern. Your rushing over there in a state of panic will not solve her problem. I stared at him, my purse clutched in my hand. The sheer, cold logic of his statement slammed into the raw, emotional urgency of the situation. "Julian," I said, my voice tight, "this is my little sister. She's heartbroken. She needs me." "What she needs," he countered, his voice infuriatingly calm, "is to develop better coping mechanisms. What you need is to maintain the boundaries we have established to protect your own mental and emotional well-being. Letting her chaos bleed into our sanctuary is a violation of the primary principle of our life together. The most loving thing you can do for her and for us is to adhere to our schedule. We can call her tomorrow during your designated family communication block and offer her logical advice. Something inside my chest, something that had been dormant for years, fractured with a loud, sharp crack. The carefully constructed walls of his logic suddenly seemed not just rigid, but cruel. I looked at the man I loved, the man whose system I had so dutifully followed, and I saw a stranger. A man who would consult a spreadsheet while his partner's sister was in pain. A man who saw human emotion as an inefficient variable to be controlled. No, I said. The word was a foreign object in my mouth, sharp and powerful. It was the first time I had ever said it to him with such finality. I pushed past him. I walked out the door into the chaotic, unscheduled night, and I did not look back. Chloe's apartment was exactly as I expected, a disaster zone. Tissues were everywhere. A half-eaten pint of ice cream was melting on the coffee table. Music was playing too loudly. She flung herself into my arms, her small body racked with sobs. It was messy. It was loud. It was heartbreakingly, beautifully real. We didn't offer practical advice. We didn't create a 5-step plan for emotional recovery. We sat on her cluttered floor, drank cheap wine from coffee mugs, mismatched coffee mugs, and I held her while she cried. I told her stories about my own heartbreak. I listened. I was just a sister. I stayed the night, sleeping on her lumpy couch. I broke at least 20 of Julian's rules. I ate junk food after p.m. I consumed more than one alcoholic beverage. I didn't floss. I slept without my custom-molded ergonomic pillow. And when I woke up the next morning with a slight headache and a crick in my neck, I felt a sense of liberation so profound it was almost holy. This messy, imperfect, compassionate act was more real, more right, than any of Julian's perfect, sterile rules. The seed of my rebellion had been planted, not in anger, but in an act of love. When I finally returned to our silent, white apartment, Julian was waiting for me. He wasn't angry. He was worse. He was disappointed. He had the look of a scientist whose prize-winning lab mouse had just inexplicably reverted to its wild, primitive state. "I'm not going to say I told you so," he began, his voice heavy with a sorrow that was both theatrical and, I suspected, completely genuine. He truly believed he had been wronged. "But look at you. You're exhausted. You're dehydrated. You've consumed inflammatory foods. You've completely derailed your sleep cycle and your weekly plan, all to immerse yourself in her predictable drama. I have to ask you, Lena, was it worth it?" I looked at him, at his perfect, well-rested face, at his calm, logical eyes, and for the first time, I didn't feel a flicker of guilt. I felt a quiet, sad, unbridgeable distance. "Yes," I said, my voice soft but firm. It was. My first act of conscious rebellion was small, pathetic even. It was a chocolate bar. A cheap, mass-produced milk chocolate bar with nuts and caramel, a trifecta of Julian disapproved ingredients. He was at a weekend conference on systems efficiency. Our apartment was empty, silent. I walked 3 blocks to a corner store, my heart pounding with a ridiculous, illicit thrill. I bought the chocolate bar with cash, a crinkled $5 bill I had tucked away. I didn't eat it on the way home. I brought it back to the scene of the crime. I sat on our perfectly white sofa, a piece of furniture upon which no food was ever to be consumed. I slowly, deliberately, unwrapped the crinkly paper. The sound was an act of vandalism in the cathedral-like silence. I took a bite. The surge of sugar and fat and processed cocoa was an explosion. It was the taste of imperfection, the taste of choice. It was the most delicious thing I had ever eaten. When I was done, I took the wrapper, walked outside, and buried it deep within a public trash can 2 blocks away, like a spy hiding evidence. It was absurd. It was exhilarating. It was mine. The chocolate bar rebellion opened a floodgate. I began a secret life, a life of tiny, mundane mutinies. I started leaving a single teaspoon in the sink overnight, a flagrant violation of the clean kitchen before bed rule. The sight of it in the morning, sitting there in all its defiant, unoptimized glory, gave me a small, secret thrill. I bought a pair of bright, garish, yellow and pink striped socks. They were the antithesis of my soft summer palette. I wore them inside my sensible gray boots, a hidden riot of color against my skin. No one else could see them, but I knew they were there. I started writing again, but not in the prescribed creative writing blocks. I bought a cheap, spiral-bound notebook and a leaky fountain pen. I would go to the library, a place Julian never frequented because he found the Dewey Decimal System charming but woefully inefficient. I would sit in a dusty corner and write. I wrote about my childhood, about my chaotic friendships, about my sister. I wrote messy, emotional, unstructured prose that was full of life and color. The words poured out of me, a torrent that had been dammed up for years. The pages were a mess of ink blots and crossed-out sentences. They were beautiful. A man as observant as Julian, a man whose entire existence was predicated on noticing patterns and anomalies, was bound to detect the glitches in my programming. He didn't find my secret notebook. He didn't find my chocolate bar wrappers. He found the socks. He was putting away the laundry, a task he always supervised to ensure my folding met his standards when he pulled them from the basket. He held them up between his thumb and forefinger as if they were contaminated. "What?" he said, his voice a flat line of disbelief. "Are these?" My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. This was it. My first real confrontation. "They're socks, Julian," I said, trying to keep my voice even. "I can see that they are socks, Lena," he said, his patience already wearing thin. "What I am asking is why they are in our home. They are yellow and pink. These are not your colors. These are aggressive, high-contrast, discordant colors. This is not like you. This is not like you." He meant it as an accusation, but to me, it sounded like a compliment. The real me, the messy me, was starting to show through the cracks of the perfect facade he had built. "I liked them," I said, my voice a little stronger. "So I bought them." He stared at me, and I could see the gears turning in his analytical mind. He was trying to solve the problem. He was trying to debug me. His response was not anger. It was a new rule. "I see," he said slowly. "Perhaps I have been giving you too much autonomy in your purchasing decisions. I think, from now on, it would be best if we made all clothing purchases together to ensure we maintain the visual harmony we have worked so hard to achieve." I didn't agree, but I didn't argue. I just nodded, but I knew, in that moment, that my small, secret rebellions were not enough. Hiding a pair of socks was not freedom. It was just a better decorated cage. His response proved that any deviation would be met not with understanding, but with more control. The only way to win was not to break the rules, but to shatter the entire system. My grand rebellion, the act that would bring the whole perfect structure crashing down, was born from a memory of my before life. Before Julian, I had loved pottery. I loved the visceral, unpredictable nature of it. I loved the feel of the cool, wet clay spinning under my hands. I loved the mess, the dust, the way a beautiful idea could collapse into a lump of mud in an instant. I loved the surrender to the fire of the kiln, never knowing exactly what would emerge. Pottery was the embodiment of everything Julian's philosophy was designed to eliminate: inefficiency, imperfection, unpredictability, and joy. I found a community arts center on the other side of town that offered evening pottery classes. It was perfect. The studio was described in the brochure as a vibrantly chaotic creative space. I signed up for a 10-week course. I told Julian I was joining a new advanced yoga class that met twice a week. Yoga was a Julian-approved activity. It was disciplined, focused, and good for the central nervous system. Pottery was its anarchic cousin. My first class was a revelation. I walked into a room that was a beautiful disaster. Clay dust coated every surface. Shelves were crammed with lopsided, gloriously imperfect creations. The air smelled of damp earth and possibility. I sat at a wheel for the first time in almost a decade, and when I plunged my hands into the bag of wet clay, it felt like coming home. I was terrible. My first attempts at a bowl collapsed into sad, muddy puddles. My cylinders were wobbly and uneven. I was covered in clay from my eyebrows to my elbows, and I was happier than I had been in years. The sheer, unadulterated joy of making something with my hands, of creating for the sake of creating, with no thought to efficiency or perfection, was a balm to my withered soul. I wasn't producing a product. I was engaging in a process, and the process was messy and human and mine. I became a master of subterfuge. I kept a yoga bag in my car, but inside was a change of clothes and towels to clean the clay from under my fingernails. I hid my muddy clothes in a sealed bag in the trunk until I could wash them at a laundromat far from our neighborhood. My finished pieces, my lopsided, beloved creations, were hidden in a box in the deepest corner of my closet, behind a stack of perfectly folded, soft summer-approved sweaters. They were my secret treasures, my proof of life. The joy I found in that studio began to change me. The humming started. I would be making our nutrient-balanced dinner, and I would find myself humming a tune, a small, unconscious bubble of happiness escaping my lips. Julian would look at me, with a tilted head. "You seem distracted lately, Lena," he'd say. "Your energy is scattered." He saw my burgeoning happiness as a system error, and he was determined to find its source. The end came on a Saturday. He was looking for a misplaced warranty for our minimalist, German-engineered toaster. I was in the living room, ostensibly reading a pre-approved book on architectural theory. I heard him in the bedroom, in our walk-in closet. I heard the rustle of clothes, and then I heard a silence, a deep, profound, and terrifying silence. I knew, with a certainty that made the blood drain from my face, that he had found the box. I walked to the bedroom door and stood there, my heart a trapped bird. He was sitting on the small white ottoman in the center of the closet, the box open at his feet. All around him were my lopsided pots and bowls, a small army of beautiful, imperfect rebels. He was holding a single mug in his hands, turning it over and over. It was the first one I had successfully made, a clumsy, thick-walled thing with a crooked handle. I loved it more than anything in our perfect apartment. He looked up at me, and his face was a mask of cold, calm fury. The disappointment was gone. The gentle condescension was gone. This was the face of the architect whose building had been defaced, the programmer whose perfect code had been corrupted by a virus. The virus was me. "What?" he said, his voice dangerously low, stripped of all its previous warmth. "Is this?" I didn't lie. I didn't make excuses. I was done hiding. I took a deep breath. "It's a mug," I said, my voice clear and steady. "I made it. I've been taking a pottery class." He stood up, his body rigid with a control that was far more terrifying than any shouting. "You lied to me," he stated. It was not a question. "For weeks you have been lying. You have been sneaking around, participating in this." He gestured to the mug with a look of profound disgust. "This messiness, this waste of time, this imperfection." He took a step towards me, his blue eyes blazing with the fire of a zealot whose one true faith has been desecrated. "I gave you a perfect life, Lena, a beautiful, orderly, stress-free existence. I designed it for you. I built it for you, piece by perfect piece. I eliminated the chaos, I eliminated the stress, I eliminated the failure. And you have thrown it all away. For what? For mud? For the right to be mediocre?" He stood before me, so close I could feel the cold radiating from him. This was the final test, the final rule. "You cannot have both, Lena," he said, his voice a final, chilling ultimatum. "You cannot have the life we have built and this chaotic, messy, pointless rebellion. You must choose, my world or yours, the rules or the chaos." And in that moment, with the phantom smell of wet clay in my nostrils. I saw the choice with a clarity so bright it was blinding. It wasn't between order and chaos. It wasn't between perfection and imperfection. It was between his life and mine. And his life, for all its beauty and order, was a barren moonscape. Mine was a messy, chaotic, unpredictable jungle. And I knew, with every fiber of my being, where I belonged. I looked at the lopsided mug still clutched in his hand. And I smiled, a real smile. Bright and messy and unapologetically mine. You're right, Julian, I said. I can't have both. I reached out and gently took my crooked, beautiful mug from his hand. I held it like a trophy. So I choose this. I held up the mug. I choose the chaos. My new apartment is small, and the walls are a vibrant, off-palette teal. My favorite orange sweater is draped over a chair. The dishwasher is probably loaded inefficiently. My closet contains a riot of colors, including a brilliant, aggressive orange sweater that I bought last week. On my windowsill sits a row of lopsided, beautifully imperfect pots. It is a messy, chaotic, unpredictable life, and it is a masterpiece. Because this time, I am the one holding the pen. The rules were his, but the future, in all its glorious, unscheduled, off-palette chaos, is finally, wonderfully, mine. The first month in my new apartment was a dizzying, terrifying, and glorious honeymoon with freedom. I reveled in the chaos. I left my shoes by the door. I bought a garish, bright orange couch that was a flagrant violation of every principle of minimalism. I ate cereal for dinner and hung my art on the walls with no thought to symmetry or spacing. I was a tourist in the country of my own life, taking giddy delight in every broken rule. The rebellion was a bonfire, and I danced around it, feeling its warmth on my face. But after the initial, fiery elation began to fade, a strange and unexpected anxiety started to creep in. I had spent years living within a system so rigid that my own decision-making muscles had atrophied. Julian had made every choice, from the brand of olive oil we used to the trajectory of my career. His rules, as oppressive as they were, had provided a kind of certainty. Now, faced with a world of infinite, unstructured choice, I often found myself paralyzed. The most acute attack came in the middle of a grocery store on a Tuesday afternoon. I stood in the coffee aisle, staring at a wall of beans from around the world. There were dozens of brands, roasts, and origins. Dark roast, light roast, single origin, blend, fair trade, organic. The sheer number of options was overwhelming. The Julian voice in my head, a ghost I couldn't seem to exorcise, began its calm, logical analysis. The Ethiopian beans have a higher acidity, which can be disruptive to gut health. The Colombian blend offers the best cost per ounce value. The Sumatra is too bold for your palate. You've never enjoyed robust flavors. My heart began to pound. My hands grew slick with sweat. It was just coffee, but it felt like a monumental test, a test I was destined to fail. I was a 30-year-old woman, and I didn't know how to buy coffee. The thought was so pathetic, so humiliating, that tears pricked at my eyes. I almost walked out of the store empty-handed. But then, another voice, a newer, quieter, one that sounded a little like me, pushed its way through the noise. It doesn't have to be the right choice, it whispered. It just has to be your choice. I took a shaky breath. I ignored the logical part of my brain. I ignored the ghost of Julian, and I reached out and picked a bag with a picture of a toucan on it. It had a bright yellow label. It was probably overpriced. I had no idea what it would taste like. My reason for choosing it was simple and pure and an act of profound defiance. I liked the bird. As I walked to the checkout, I clutched the bag of coffee like a trophy. It was a small, silly victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. I was learning, one ridiculous, inefficient choice at a time, how to be free. The biggest choice, the one that scared me most, was reconnecting with the life I had abandoned. My sister, Chloe, was a constant, loving presence, but I missed my friends. I especially missed Simone, the artist whose chaotic energy Julian had so despised. Our friendship hadn't ended with a fight, but with a slow, painful fade out on my part, a ghosting born of guilt and shame. Finding her number in my old phone felt like excavating a fossil. It took me 3 days to work up the courage to call. She answered on the second ring. "Lena," she said, her voice a mixture of surprise and something else, something I couldn't quite read. "Hi, Simone," I said, my voice small. "I know it's been a very long time, and I know I was a terrible friend. I don't have a good excuse, but I have a reason, and I'd love to tell you about it, if you'd let me." There was a pause on the other end of the line, a silence that stretched for an eternity. "I'm in my studio," she finally said. "Come over and bring coffee. The kind with the toucan on it, if you can find it." I laughed, a real, surprised bark of a laugh. She had seen me at the grocery store. Of course she had. Simone's studio was the glorious, beautiful opposite of Julian's apartment. It was an explosion of life. Canvases leaned against every wall, splattered with vibrant, angry, joyful colors. Jars packed with brushes stood everywhere. The air smelled of turpentine and clay and creative energy. She was standing in the middle of it all, covered in a fine layer of blue paint, and she was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. "You look like you again," she said, her eyes scanning my face. She wasn't smiling, not yet. And so I told her everything. The rules, the dishwasher diagram, the soft summer color palette, the pottery class, the lopsided mug. I laid the whole absurd, tragic, and ridiculous story at her feet. When I finished, she was silent for a long time, just looking at me. "I knew he was an ass," she said finally, her voice low and fierce. "But I didn't know he was a cult leader. Lena, I am so sorry. I'm sorry I didn't fight harder for you. It wasn't your fight," I said, tears welling in my eyes. "I had to do it myself, I know," she said. And then she smiled, a huge, brilliant, paint-splattered smile. "But the next fight, you call me. We'll throw paint on his perfect white walls together." She pulled me into a hug that smelled like turpentine and forgiveness, and I felt another huge, essential piece of myself click back into place. The final echo of my old life appeared a month later. I was at a farmer's market on a sunny Saturday morning, buying fresh flowers and ridiculously expensive cheese, reveling in the simple joy of making my own choices. And I saw him, Julian. He was across the square, examining a display of organic heirloom tomatoes. He was impeccable, of course, in a crisp linen shirt and perfectly tailored trousers. He looked exactly the same, but I was completely different. My first instinct was a jolt of pure, cold adrenaline, a flight response honed over years. I wanted to hide behind a tent, to disappear into the crowd, but I held my ground. I stood still and just watched him. He looked like a man from a different country, a different lifetime, a black and white photograph in my now vividly colorful world. He picked out a single, perfect tomato, paid the vendor, and walked away. He never saw me. Our orbits, once so tightly intertwined, no longer intersected. I felt a profound sense of detachment, a calm, final peace. He was no longer my monster. He was just a man buying a tomato. That evening, I invited Chloe and Simone over to my little apartment. We cooked dinner together. We used every pot and pan. We spilled wine on the floor and laughed about it. We loaded the dishwasher with a joyful, flagrant inefficiency. The apartment was filled with noise and mess, and the vibrant, beautiful chaos of a life being lived. After they left, I stood in my quiet, messy kitchen and looked at the lopsided mug I had made, the one that started it all. It was sitting on my counter, holding a small, cheerful bouquet of wildflowers. It was still imperfect. It was still a little crooked, but it was strong. It held water. It held flowers. It held the story of my rebellion. And I realized my new life wasn't about having no rules. It was about finally getting to write my own. And the first rule, the only rule, was that they had to be beautiful and messy and wonderfully unapologetically mine. The months that followed my final, distant sighting of Julian were a quiet exploration of my own rediscovered country. The initial, frantic joy of rebellion settled into a calmer, more profound sense of self-possession. I had won the war against his rules, but now I faced the more complex and far more interesting challenge of peacetime, the challenge of building a life from the ground up, with no blueprint but my own desires. My work, the freelance writing that had always paid the bills, felt different now. The sterile, soulless articles I had written under Julian's scheduled creative blocks seemed like artifacts from another civilization. My secret notebook, the one I had filled at the library, was brimming with the messy, honest prose that was my own true voice. It was a voice I had almost forgotten, and rediscovering it felt like meeting an old, beloved friend. The stories were about my chaotic childhood, about my sister, about the vibrant, flawed people I had known and loved. They were, I realized, the foundation of a book. Not just a book, but the book I had always been too scared, too disorganized, or too suppressed to write. The decision to try and write it felt like a leap off a cliff. It was one thing to rebel in secret with a chocolate bar or a pottery class. It was another thing entirely to commit to a massive, uncertain creative project. The ghost of Julian was a constant, whispering critic in my ear. A novel? His voice would say as I stared at a blank page. It's statistically improbable to succeed. It's an inefficient use of your time. Your freelance work provides a steady income. This is an emotional, impulsive decision. I almost listened. The fear of failure, the fear he had so expertly cultivated in me, was a powerful deterrent. But then I would talk to Simone. I went to her studio, my notebook clutched in my hand like a talisman, and I read a few pages aloud to her. Her reaction was not logical or analytical. It was pure, unadulterated emotion. "Lena," she said, her eyes shining, paint flecks on her cheek like freckles. "That's it. That's you. That's the voice I've missed. You have to write this. Who cares if it's inefficient? Art isn't supposed to be efficient. It's supposed to be true." Her belief in me was a shield against the phantom voice of my old life. I made a decision. I cut back on my freelance work, taking a significant financial risk. I dedicated my mornings not to a scheduled block, but to the story. Some days I would write for 10 hours, lost in the flow. Other days I would write a single agonizing sentence and then spend the rest of the day walking through the city, thinking. It was a messy, inefficient, and deeply joyful process. I was no longer just rebelling against his rules. I was creating my own. And the first rule of my new life was that my own voice, my own story, mattered more than anything else. As my professional life became a space of intentional creation, my personal life began to cautiously, unexpectedly bloom. I wasn't looking for a relationship. The thought of intertwining my life with someone else's again was terrifying. But then, I met David. He was a chef I met at the farmer's market, a man with flour in his eyebrows and a laugh that was loud and easy. He ran a small, beloved neighborhood bistro that was known for its creative, soulful food. He was, in every conceivable way, the antithesis of Julian. Our first date was at his restaurant after it had closed for the night. He cooked for me, and the kitchen was a beautiful, controlled chaos of sizzling pans and clattering utensils. He didn't follow a recipe. He cooked by instinct, by feel, by a deep and joyful understanding of his ingredients. He was an artist, and his medium was food. Dating him was an exercise in unlearning. My nervous system, so finely tuned to detect the subtle signs of control, was on high alert. One evening, he came to my apartment for the first time. He looked around at my chaotic bookshelves, a loving jumble of genres and sizes. He smiled, and as I was in the kitchen getting us drinks, he took a few minutes to rearrange a single shelf, grouping a few of my favorite poetry books together. He turned to me, his expression open and pleased. "I just saw these and thought they deserved to be together," he said. For a split second, a cold, sickening dread washed over me. It was the ghost of Julian and his Library of Congress system, his unsolicited optimization. My breath caught in my throat. My hands tensed. I almost said, "Don't touch my things. Don't try to fix me," but I stopped. I looked at his face. There was no condescension there. There was no smug satisfaction of a problem solved. There was only the simple, open affection of someone who had paid attention, who had noticed what I loved, and who wanted to honor it. His act wasn't about imposing order. It was about creating connection. "Thank you," I said, my voice a little shaky. "I love them like that." He smiled, oblivious to the internal war I had just fought and won. "Good," he said simply. "So, what's for dinner?" It was in these small moments that I learned the difference between a partner who wants to control you and a partner who wants to know you. Julian had seen my chaos as a flaw to be eliminated. David saw it as a part of me to be understood and even celebrated. With him, I didn't have to be perfect or efficient. I just had to be me. And it was a revelation. After nearly a year of late nights and early mornings, of wrestling with words and memories, I typed the final sentence of my novel. The manuscript was a living, breathing thing. It was the story of a girl named Clara who lives in a world of black and white, governed by 1,000 tiny rules, who rediscovers her own color. It was not a perfect book. It was messy and emotional and intensely personal. It was, I knew, the truest thing I had ever written. The process of sending it out to literary agents was a new kind of terror. It was one thing to write the book for myself in the privacy of my own home. It was another to offer it up to the world for judgment. Each rejection letter, and there were many, felt like a confirmation of Julian's prophecy. It's self-indulgent. It's not commercially viable. It's chaotic. The ghost of his voice was loud in the silence of my empty inbox. I was close to giving up, to putting the manuscript in a drawer and going back to the safe, predictable world of freelance corporate writing. I was telling David about it one night, my voice full of defeat. "Maybe he was right," I murmured. "Maybe I am just a mess. Maybe my voice isn't one people want to hear." David stopped chopping vegetables for the dinner he was making. He turned to me, his expression serious. "Lena," he said, "do you think a perfectly ripe tomato is worried about whether it's commercially viable? Do you think the ocean cares if its waves are inefficient? Your voice is true. It's real. That's what matters. The right person will hear it. You just have to keep speaking." His unwavering belief in me was the antidote to the poison of my own doubt. The next day, I sent the manuscript to 5 more agents. A week later, I got a call. It was from an agent named Maria, a sharp, passionate woman who spoke with the same kind of energy as my friend Simone. "I read your book in one sitting," she said, her voice buzzing with excitement. "I didn't sleep. It's raw, and it's beautiful, and it's necessary. The voice of Clara is a voice thousands of women need to hear. I want to represent you." I sat there on my orange couch, the phone pressed to my ear, and I began to cry. They were not tears of sadness or fear. They were tears of profound, earth-shattering validation. My voice, the one I had been told was too much, too messy, too chaotic, was not just worthy. It was necessary. Getting a book deal was a surreal experience. My manuscript, my secret act of rebellion, was going to be a real book, with a cover and an ISBN and a place on a shelf in a store. My agent, Maria, was a force of nature, and she secured a deal with a wonderful, independent publisher who loved the book as much as she did. The editing process was rigorous and wonderful. My editor, a thoughtful man named Sam, didn't try to sand down the rough edges of my story. He helped me make them sharper. He understood that the book's power was in its raw, unfiltered honesty. As the publication date grew closer, however, a new kind of anxiety began to surface. It was the fear of being seen. For years, I had lived a small, contained life, first under Julian's rules, and then in my own quiet, rebellious world. Now, my most personal story was about to be made public. The thought of strangers reading about Clara's journey, which was so deeply intertwined with my own, was terrifying. What would people think? What if people from my past read it? What if Julian read it? The thought sent a jolt of cold fear through me. I imagined him reading it, his face a mask of cold fury, or worse, of condescending pity. I imagined him dissecting it, analyzing it, telling people, see? I told you she was a mess. She's made a spectacle of her own instability. The fear of his judgment, even from a distance, still had a vestige of power. I confessed this fear to David one evening as we were walking by the river. I'm scared, I admitted. I feel like I'm handing him a weapon to use against me all over again. David stopped walking and turned to face me. He took both of my hands in his. Lena, he said, his gaze steady and serious. When you were with him, he controlled the narrative. He told you who you were, what you felt, what happened. This book is you taking the pen back. You are telling the story now. You can't control how he or anyone else reads it. And that's okay, because it's not his story anymore. It's yours, and your telling of it is the only one that matters. His words settled something deep inside me. He was right. The ultimate freedom was not just in writing my story, but in releasing it, in letting it go and trusting that its truth would be its own shield. It was the final, terrifying, and most necessary act of my rebellion, the act of being vulnerable on my own terms. I couldn't live in a world of my own perfect rules either. I had to live in the messy, unpredictable world and trust that my own voice was strong enough to survive in it. The book launch party was held at a local independent bookstore, a place with overflowing shelves and the rich, comforting smell of paper and ink. The room was packed with people who had loved me through every version of myself. My sister, Chloe, was there, her laughter echoing through the room. Simone stood near the front, a proud splash of color in a sea of black, her smile so wide it looked like it might split her face. David was by my side, his hand a warm, steady presence in the small of my back. My team from the publishing house, my agent Maria, my editor Sam, they were all there. It was a room full of my new life, a life I had chosen, a life I had built. When it was time for me to speak, I walked to the small makeshift stage, my heart pounding, not with fear, but with a full, resounding joy. I opened my book to a marked page. I'm just going to read a short passage, I said, my voice clear and strong. This is from a moment when Clara, my main character, is learning to make choices for herself again. I took a breath and began to read. I read about Clara standing in a grocery store, paralyzed by the coffee aisle. I read about her decision to buy the bag with the toucan on it, simply because she liked the bird. I read the final line of the chapter. It was a small choice, a silly choice, an inefficient choice, but it was hers. And in a world that had tried to steal her very thoughts, the act of choosing a coffee bean for no reason other than delight was not just a choice. It was a revolution. When I looked up, the room was silent, and I saw tears in my sister's eyes, in Simone's eyes. They understood. They knew the weight of that small, silly choice. After the reading, I sat at a table to sign books. A long line formed. Near the end of the line was a young woman, probably in her early 20s. When it was her turn, she approached the table, clutching my book to her chest. I finished your book last night, she said, her voice trembling slightly. I feel like you wrote it for me. It made me feel less alone. It made me feel like maybe I could choose the toucan too. I looked at her earnest, hopeful face, and I saw a reflection of a younger me, a girl who just needed one person to tell her that her own instincts were valid. I took her book and opened it to the title page. For a fellow revolutionary, I wrote, keep choosing the toucan. With love, Lena. She read it and looked up at me, her eyes shining with tears, but this time, they were tears of recognition, of hope. She nodded, speechless, and walked away, clutching the book like a shield. I watched her go, and in that moment, my journey came full circle. The rebellion, which had started as a secret, desperate act of self-preservation, had become something else entirely. It had become a story, and that story, my story, was no longer just mine. It was out in the world, a small light for other people who might be lost in the dark, a quiet whisper telling them that their voice matters, that their choices are their own, and that their own beautiful, messy, chaotic life is worth fighting for. I looked across the room and met David's smiling eyes. The future was no longer a rebellion against old rules. It was a creation of new stories, and I had so many more to write.